Today I'm going to talk about why people don't listen to experts. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. So a little while back I got a comment that was asking about why, I think it was on my Dunning Kruger video, and it was about why people don't listen to experts. And there were several topics cited, like climate change and possibly stuff related to viral spread and some other stuff like that. I forget the exact thing. And the actual short answer is people do listen to experts, both in the good and bad sense. But why doesn't everybody listen to experts in the sense of simply trusting them what they say? And the answer to this is actually, it's fairly simple because people actually have a very strong tendency to listen to experts, unless they're very young. Very young people often have trouble listening to experts in a real sense. But outside of that, the key to understanding why people do or don't listen to experts, and the distinction is very important, is that people listen to experts about the thing that the expert is actually an expert in. But when it comes to an expert, you have to ask, what is it that they're actually expert in? And there's a really good analogy, or a really good example of a key distinction to make here. And it was actually 25 years ago, I saw some interesting advice on how to pick a martial arts studio, how to pick a martial arts teacher. And a big part of the advice was, don't look at how well he does martial arts. That's about how good he is at the thing. Look at his students and see how good they are. Because it doesn't matter how much money you're going to pay him, you're not going to be him. But you can be one of his students. So look at how good a teacher he is, because what you're paying him for is not for him to do martial arts, but to teach you how to do martial arts. And this is a very key distinction, because when you go to a teacher, what do you want expertise in? You want expertise in teaching. You don't want expertise in doing martial arts. In point of fact, I mean, you could have a guy who's confined to a wheelchair who's the best martial arts teacher in the world. Mildly unlikely for various reasons relating a lot to demonstrations. Pardon. But nonetheless, it really illustrates the key of understanding what is somebody an expert actually in. So now when it comes to, say, for example, an academic, somebody who studies some subject, and let's say it's somebody who studies frogs, right? We'll keep this nice and abstract. It applies all over the place, but we'll keep it nice and abstract to keep it, not being, easy to see, because, partisan rancor is not going to enter into it. So, let's say this is a person who studies spotted river frogs somewhere. Now, suppose that spotted river frogs are incredibly hard to find, such that the person who has spent the last 20 years studying spotted river frogs has managed to come across spotted river frogs in the wild a grand total of 5 times. How much about spotted river frogs do you think this person knows? And the answer is not much. I mean, if you think this person knows much, you're an idiot. I don't believe anyone watching this video would think that. You would, you kind of know. Like, okay, you saw spotted river frogs 5 times. I made them up, by the way, just to be clear. I mean, there must be river frogs that are spotted, but, but you've seen them 5 times in your entire life. How much can you have learned about spotted river frogs 5 times? And the answer is very, very little. Now, what are things that you have done quite a lot of? Well, you've done quite a lot of not finding spotted river frogs. So you can give some pretty good advice on how to not find spotted river frogs. Now, you might actually be better than anyone else at finding spotted river frogs, but since you almost entirely fail, your ability to give advice here is actually very limited. There's some other things you're very good at, like writing papers about spotted river frogs despite not having found them, applying for grant money to look for spotted river frogs. These things you will have done a fair amount, and in fact, those second two, you'll have done a fair amount of successfully. Now, you will do other things, like you'll give talks about spotted river frogs, but, how well did you do that, actually? Well, it's going to depend on how often you get invited back to give talks on spotted river frogs, given that you have approximately nothing to say about spotted river frogs. So we can look at what is the key to seeing what you're actually an expert on, the sort of thing where, learning would actually make sense. Learning from you would actually make sense. And the answer is, it's in the things where you get feedback as to your success or failure and refine over time to primarily get success. So, now in a technical sense, it's primarily get success relative to, there are things where you're never going to be super successful at them on a per instance basis, but success is defined as being able to succeed 1 out of every 10 times, and you just have to try an awful lot. For a lot of people, hunting is like that, by the way. A lot of the time, hunting, whether you're an animal or whether you're a human, most hunts are unsuccessful, and you just need to succeed every now and again at hunting in order to, because you get a large reward when you do it. So I don't mean you have to succeed every time. But the point is, you have to get to the point where you succeed in some sense reliably enough to produce a useful result. And you need to have feedback as to whether or not you actually are succeeding often enough to get a useful result. And so if you want to learn about spotted river frogs from our hypothetical spotted river frog person, there's doesn't have much to tell you. Is he an expert in spotted river frogs? In the sense that he knows more about them than anyone else? Yes. In the sense that he knows enough about them to actually have anything worth saying about them? No. However, let's say you want to learn how you can get grants for, despite the fact that you consistently fail and never have anything to show for your efforts. Or the things that you have to show for your efforts on occasion are pitiful and insignificant. Well, this is a person who would be fabulous to go to, because for the last 20 years they have been managing to get grants to study a thing that they're not actually studying and have pitiful amounts of success to show as a result. They've done this a lot. You can tell that they have in fact succeeded at this goal. There's a lot they can tell you about how to write grants for things where you haven't succeeded in the past and you probably won't succeed in the future either. They've done that a lot. They're an expert in getting grants. Let's say they've also got a decent publishing history. Again, if you want advice on how to publish without having anything to say in your story, in your articles, this is a phenomenal person to go to, because he has a lot of experience and direct feedback that he succeeded at getting articles published, despite the fact that there's nothing in them. And nothing of substance, I should say. There's a bunch of words, but they don't actually mean anything informative about spotted river frogs. So what is this expert in spotted river frogs actually an expert in? Well, not spotted river frogs. He's an expert in things like how to survive in academia. He's an expert in how to survive in academia despite the fact that you're not actually producing much of anything. So it's even more specialized skill. So this is, and you can see the same basic thing. So take it to a very different field, take it to a mechanic, say a car mechanic. You can be a very good car mechanic without really knowing how the thing works. If you're really good at diagnosing which part that, if replaced, will make the car work again, you don't actually have to know how the thing works to be successful at this, because what you actually do, the thing you're actually doing, is not saying how the car works. It is identifying which part you should probably replace, and then you try to replace that and see if if the vehicle now works. And as you get better and better at this over time and refining it, you can become very good at identifying which parts you should replace based on symptoms without understanding at all how these things actually function or what is wrong with the parts. So, some motor doesn't work. You can easily identify the motor doesn't work without having the least idea about alternating magnetic fields inducing motion. But that if you hear that sound, that sound always means, that grinding sound, you hear that one? And you're like, oh, wait, there's a grinding sound? Yeah, that faint grinding sound. That means that the motor isn't working. We need to replace the motor. Takes out the motor, puts in a new one. Presto, the thing's working now. Away you go. A person can be an expert here, not in a car per se, but his expertise would be in identifying parts to replace. So if you strike up a conversation with him and ask him how the car actually works, he may well have nothing to tell you. You can ask him, what's the best thing that I can do in order to keep my car from breaking? He may well have no idea. He may well be no better at telling you this than anyone else is. In point of fact, it's highly, sorry for hitting the microphone there. It's highly likely that the person who designed the car, who's bad at diagnosing and fixing them, can tell you what is most important in maintaining the thing. Can tell you that here are the bearing surfaces, so you need to keep them lubricated and make sure to, do this with the engine, because otherwise it'll grind. He'll have no idea how to diagnose when that's actually gone wrong, but he'll actually be much better at this, but he's not the car expert. So these are two examples that sort of illustrate, I think, the problem space. And so when it comes to experts on whatever field, the question to ask for all of them, and which people instinctively ask about these experts, is the thing that this person is saying, is the thing this person is claiming their expertise backs up, a thing where they have been doing this quite a lot and have been getting direct feedback on success or failure of what they're saying, such that the thing that they're saying is the summation of a large amount of experience where they've gotten direct feedback that the thing is actually true. So, if somebody tells you that I think the spotted river frog actually comes out and mates on trees. I mean, I've never seen it, but like that's my working theory of where the spotted river frog mates, because like I've never seen them mate in the river, and kind of with that current it'd be a little bit hard anyway. How much are you going to take that seriously? I mean, maybe it's a plausible guess, maybe not. On the other hand, when he tells you that, like, okay, so the key when you're putting in your grant application is do this sort of search on last year's grant, on the grants that are getting a lot of money. Like, look up what the big research grants are, and then make sure to include several of the keywords that you find commonly in them within your paper. They don't have to even be very direct. It's just important that it comes up on the keyword search. And then we're going to, refine on the angle. Well, okay, this guy has done a lot. How much do you believe him here? You should believe him a lot, because he's done this quite often, and when he hasn't done it, he hasn't gotten those grant applications haven't worked. On the ones where he's done it, he's gotten money on those grant applications. Here he's gotten a lot of direct feedback on the thing that he's saying in terms of success or failure, real world success or failure. And so whatever expert you're looking at, the question is the pronouncements that they're making, and this is especially true if they are predicting the future, by the way. How often have they done this in the past and then been able to see when they were right and when they were wrong, and they were rewarded for being right and punished for being wrong, such that they steered very much towards the always being right here because of the direct and immediate and reliable feedback that they were getting on their performance? If they have been, if this is the sort of thing where this really does work that way, then it's the sort of thing where most people will listen to that person. Most people will treat that person as an expert. On the other hand, if this is merely a person who has been studying the thing for the last 35 years, but could just be completely making all of it up for all that any of this has ever been checked against anything, well, then there's absolutely no reason to listen to such a person. So, like, suppose there was a field of chromopaleontology, where you and you have to be slightly careful here, because there are certain things about pigments that actually can be left in dinosaur skin. But let's say that the field of chromopaleontology refers to looking up the sorts of colors that dinosaurs really found aesthetically pleasing. Now, there's precisely no way you can ever check any of this. You can make up as many theories as you like about how Tyrannosaurus really didn't like the color red, and how Triceratops loved the color green and found it very pleasing. And there's no way to know. There's no way whatsoever to verify this. Now, you and a bunch of your closest frenemies can go and publish papers and have the Journal of Chromopaleontology and refer each other's papers in the Journal of Chromopaleontology, and you can agree with the general consensus of other chromopaleontologists as to what colors various dinosaurs found aesthetically pleasing. And there can be shifts in the general trend, and you can look over the direction of how prevailing theories of chromopaleontology have moved. Is there any reason in the world to take this body of experts who have been studying chromopaleontology, they're the fourth generation of people in these 50-year-old journals who've been studying chromopaleontology all this time, is there any reason to listen to these people whatsoever on the colors that dinosaurs preferred over anybody at all? Or just paying no attention because no one can know? And the answer is no. There would be no reason whatsoever, despite the fact that they've got impressive academic credentials, despite the fact that they write peer-reviewed papers, despite the fact that they're familiar with all of the material and the leading theories and have examined this and thought very carefully about it, there is precisely no anchoring to reality going on here. They're simply talking amongst themselves with theories in the air that have no connection whatsoever to anything. And so, I mean, it's pretty, okay, at the extremes. Like, is it likely that they were able to see low frequency radio waves? No, because, like, a little bit of physics and you can tell, like, the structures needed to actually be able to receive these things with any sort of resolution would be bigger than what the dinosaurs actually had. And, is it likely they could see gamma ray bursts? No, because amongst other things, those don't really make it down to Earth very well. Not in any sort of vaguely useful fashion. And so, like, there's some extremes where they're probably correct about these things because, like, anybody would be if they studied that portion of it even slightly. But outside of the extremes where things get, like, where things actually do get anchored to reality simply by things like basic physics or simple logic or whatever, that there's no reason whatsoever to listen to these hypothetical people going on about chromopaleontology, where, again, by chromopaleontology, I mean, like, the study of dinosaurs' favorite colors. The point of this being that here you can have people with all the trappings of being experts in a field. They've studied it more than anybody else. Who is more likely to be correct than these people? And the answer is anyone. In this case, like, you can have the trappings of being an expert, but because there is no mooring to reality in any way, there's no reason to suppose that you're in any way correct. And this is where you see a lot of so-called experts being ignored, is that if you look into how would these people actually know what they're talking about, the answer is, well, they can't. You can see a lot of this in nutrition, by the way. There are things about nutrition which really are very clear. Things like macronutrients, that you use carbohydrates and fats for energy, protein being the building block of muscles. If you don't eat macronutrients, you starve to death. If you don't get enough protein, you get diseases like kwashiorkor and your muscles waste away and so on for sufficiently low quantities of protein. And so on. So, like, there are things in nutrition that are well known. These things, are observable and they're readily detectable. And you can also find these things out because they share, commonalities with all sorts of animal models on which you can actually run experiments, because you can ethically take a rat and keep it in a cage and feed it zero protein and see what happens over time. And rats and we function fairly similarly when it comes to protein, so you can see that. You can take we've also just observed what happens if you don't feed people anything. So there are things that are known because they do have, they are more to reality. But on the other hand, like, if somebody is proposing that, like, lots of green tea is good for you over the long run, or that coffee is bad for you over the long run, or that coffee is good for you over the long run, well, you can't run any actual controlled studies on this. You can't divide two people up into groups and give one coffee and the other not coffee and do this for an extremely long time. There's some things where you can ask people to comply with this. And then, whatever compliance you get over the course of years will radically taint your data because people don't tend to comply very well with anything. People can sign up for certain types of very, very short-term stuff, can sign up to, like, actually be in a hospital where you're constantly monitoring them. You're giving them all of their food to ensure compliance. This is phenomenally expensive and you can only do it for incredibly short time. So telling, what is the actual effect of drinking coffee for 40 years, you have no way of actually running these experiments. And so the problem with a lot of nutrition is that you have all sorts of theories, but they're not really based on much of anything. They're based on minor things. I don't want to digress into nutrition specifically, but a lot of the time what you have is, like, long-term hypotheses based on either very short-term results that are often suspiciously short-term, as in, like, one that comes to mind is, like, with salt and hypertension, where the short-term you can change people's blood pressure a little bit with increasing or decreasing the amount of sodium in their diet by large increases or large decreases will have an effect statistically on it in the short term. The problem is there's some pretty good evidence that in the long term you eventually hit like your body adapts and you sort of return to normal over time, so that like in the short term this makes a modification, but in the long term it really has no effect because your body can adapt to a very wide range of things. And there's a lot of stuff where that seems to be the case, that there are things that your body will adapt to over time such that long-term results are different than short-term results. There's also the flip side too, by the way, of things that in the short term don't really cause any problems, but in the long term do accumulate problems. So like, the actual, real health effects of going on like a massive alcohol bender, like drinking large amounts of alcohol. It doesn't have any massive health effects in the short term. So like, you do this and then, in the short term, but like if you keep on doing this over time, eventually bad results accumulate, and because you're not starting from the same point. And so you can accumulate deleterious effects that like you wouldn't really see. It would not actually be really measurable in the short term, but if you repeat it, become measurable in the long term. So there are all sorts of things that mean that it is phenomenally difficult to be an expert in the legitimate sense of having direct feedback as to success or failure, especially because if it comes to like what is a healthy way to eat for 40 years, you can't have direct experience of that. I mean, amongst other things, if you start telling people how to eat, 40 years later, you'll see how it goes out, but then like, assuming you started when you were in your 20s, you're now retired anyway. And so you have some idea of the particular effects of the thing, assuming people followed it, which I can pretty much guarantee you that they didn't, yada, yada. So when you look at, like that, like why don't people listen to nutrition experts? Well, like with any expert, the fundamental question you have to ask is, how do these people know what they claim to know? And is that way of knowing what they claim to know actually a viable way of knowing what they claim to know? And what is the case for an awful lot of claimed experts is that when you look into it, and you're asking the question in good faith, like you're not like trying to catch them out, you're trying to ask like, okay, how do you actually know that this is the case? How have you come to actually know what it is you claim to know? And then they give you an answer that simply doesn't work. And at that point, it's like, well, if your answer is implausible, or otherwise like and really inconvenient, or too expensive or too difficult or prohibitive of doing other things or whatever, and there's no reason to believe that it's actually true because like your reason for believing this is true is garbage. I mean, you can easily produce plenty of examples of things that are false that you can produce that amount of evidence for, or that type of evidence for, etc. Then like, yeah, there's absolutely no reason to listen to such an expert. So this ultimately really is the key. It is that experts are people, true experts are people who receive frequent and direct feedback about whether they're right or wrong. And who, to some degree, who also where this feedback has sort of a positive or negative effect on pushing them more in the direction of being right or being wrong. Like, are you rewarded for being right and punished for being wrong in this feedback loop? But I mean, mere honesty and curiosity can suffice for the reward of being right and the punishment of being wrong, by the way. It doesn't have to be like a direct like threat to your livelihood or you succeed sort of thing. But it's got to be something like where you will then trend in the direction of the feedback, where the feedback is actually guiding you. And an awful lot of people who claim to be experts, when you look into the simple question of like, well, how do you know that you're right? Like, how do you know that your theory is actually true? What feedback have you been getting on a consistent basis that has led you to this conclusion? And if the answer is you haven't been getting this feedback, or this feedback consists of like other people telling you that you're who have no reason to know what they're doing, telling you that you're great or whatever, well, then you're not really an expert, except at being told that you're great by other people, or at publishing, or being quoted constantly despite no one, nothing that you say ever being verified when there's the possibility of it being verified, or the people who go on the news to predict what's going to happen in the future and they're always wrong and they keep on getting asked back. Like that kind of expert. Why isn't that expert listened to? Well, I mean, in some sense the question answers itself. So I just wanted to look into that, the specifics of like, when is a person an expert, when aren't they? And even so, even when a person isn't an expert in the thing they claim to be, they may well be an expert in some tangential things. And if nothing else, a con artist is an expert in how to con people. So, as a con artist who may know absolutely nothing about the field that he's trying to convince you that he's, like an investment expert, he probably does know a lot about how you win people's confidence. And so if what you want to know is how you win people's confidence, and you have some way of getting him to be honest with you, even though he's not at all the expert in investment strategy that he claimed to be when he's trying to swindle you out of money, you may possibly be able to get some actually useful things about how human confidence works out of him, because he is at least an expert in that. And so it goes with an awful lot of things. There are a lot of things that where people are not experts in what they claim to be, but they are experts in something tangentially related to it, and may still be useful for information there. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at. If you like this video, then clicking the like button, according to YouTube, will make them more likely to recommend it to others. If you know anyone who might get something out of this video, then it would be kind to share it with them, or just share it on social media in general. And if you'd like to see future videos of mine, you can subscribe. And if you're not in the habit of checking your subscriptions page regularly, then I suggest clicking the notification bell and setting that to always, because otherwise subscribing to a channel basically just sort of like gives YouTube a hint that maybe it should consider recommending these videos to you, possibly at some point, if they think so. It's a funny world we live in. God bless.